Very interesting speakers, and starting with Lee Trainer, who is from Hanover in Germany, but you'll tell by his accent originally Australian. Lee is looking at teaching species origins.
Right, it's been some time since I was last in New Zealand, 34 years, but it's nice to be back, and it's sorry I couldn't make it any earlier. The work that we're celebrating this weekend is sometimes erroneously referred to as the origin of the species. And I saw the playwright on Friday also refer to it as the origin of the species, and that tells us something about the mindset of those people, doesn't it? I've been doing research into students' conceptions about species and species origins and the scientific conceptions, and I'll be presenting some of that work today. The method that I've been using to look at the conceptions is a thing called qualitative content analysis, using inductive category formation to boil down lots and lots of information, to reduce redundancy, to reveal figures of thought that people use when they are talking about species or origins of species. The research questions are, then, what do students think about species and whether species can change? And what do scientists think about species and how species change? First of all, the students' conceptions. Now, I'm taking a very broad range of students' conceptions. Their conceptions are pretty resilient. You'll meet them with older students in senior high school. You'll meet them with children who are basically verbal. And it's you can show them a picture of an organism, and they will tell you from the morphology of what they see of what that organism is. So they start with the morphology. Once they've determined what animal or plant it is, that's what it is, and you can't change it. So that if you have a yellow and white cat with black vertical stripes on it, it is a tiger. If you bleach out the stripes and sew a mane onto it, it's still a tiger. It doesn't change into a lion. Now, you ask the children, well, why doesn't it change into a lion? I've changed the appearance of it. You said that you judge by the appearances. And they'll say, well, if they're 3 or 4 years old, they'll say, well, it's in its guts. As they get older, they become more sophisticated, and they say, well, it's in its genes. Neither of them know what they're talking about, but the idea is that this essence of whatever the organism is resides in the organism. It's also hereditary. It can be passed from the parents to the offspring, and it's programmatical in the sense that if you have a bird growing up with a family of ducks, and it is the ugly duckling, it will turn out to be a swan in the end. Now, students have some other ideas as well. They have an idea of agency. They have an idea of individuality. They can distinguish between artifacts and natural kinds. These are very useful skills to have when negotiating the real world. They may or may not be useful in working out how species originate. Let's look at the scientific conceptions. We'll start off with some very old conceptions, the classical conception also of an essence. But this essence is somewhat different. It doesn't reside in the organisms itself. The organisms partake or participate in the essence. The essence is in the world of ideas, in the supernatural world. Now, that is very close to what children think, but it's not quite what children think. Now, I'll come back to why this is important in just a minute. Let's move on to Lamarck. Now, Lamarck, well, before we go on to Lamarck, another thing about the classical idea is there's no concept of extinction. Whatever essences there are eternal, and they will always result in new organisms being produced of that particular species. Now, Lamarck also has a problem with extinction because his idea of simpler life forms striving to become more complex forms and becoming more complex forms in the course of time, it negates the idea of having an essence because there is a program of life that's being carried out. But Lamarck has a problem with extinction because his chain of being must be continuous. As lower organisms move up the rungs of the ladder and vacate the lowest rungs, there's abiogenesis at the bottom. But there is a continuous line from whatever microorganisms there were to us as the pinnacle of biology. And that means that if there is an extinction, the whole chain of being has to start over. So that is one problem with Lamarck. Now we come on to the more modern ideas and Darwin.